So now that you have your 4 claims and you've completed your visual organizer and drafted your body paragraphs, it's time to look at what you've collected and assemble a thesis that synthesizes all the different arguments that you've made into one umbrella statement that covers everything you're going to talk about in your paper. Now, normally a thesis can be done in one sentence, but often it takes a couple of sentences to do it, especially if your artifacts move in a lot of different directions in terms of how you interpret them. So it's going to be a 2-step process to create a thesis. And the first step, I would like you to create a range for your tension, or a spectrum. And you can see on the screen here that I've created a spectrum for the tension that I've been writing about in the various drafts that I've shared with you, the tension between nature as transcendent and nature as commodity. And so all the way to the left, I put in bold nature as transcendent. So you can see I've done that over here. And then to the right, I put nature as commodity. And what I do is I place my 4 artifacts along that spectrum. So in my case, Pollock's Autumn Rhythm seems all about nature as transcendent, and Alexander Haig's Erosions 2, Earth Mother Laid Bare seems all about nature as a commodity to me. So 2 of my artifacts align with the extreme ends of the spectrum. But in my case, 2 of my artifacts are mixed. They refer to nature as transcendent and to nature as a commodity. They see both happening simultaneously. That, frankly, for me, is one of the things that makes them so interesting. And it involves 2 sculptures created by Robert Smithson and Nancy Holt. My point is not that you need to have artifacts that spread across the spectrum like these do, but that what you need to do is look at the artifacts you have and ask, where do they fall on the spectrum, and visually, physically line them up. Maybe all 4 of yours would be under nature as transcendent, or maybe all 4 of yours would be under nature as commodity. That's fine. You're not required to have balance in your paper. You're just required to make an accurate and convincing reading of where on the spectrum each artifact falls. I just wanted to give you a complex example so you could see sort of not a worst case scenario, but a most complicated case scenario, because the variations are easier to do. So once we've got our spectrum created, now we can draft a thesis. And if you look at what I've done here, I won't read it to you. You can always pause the video and watch it. You can see that in the first sentence of the thesis, I talk about Pollock and Haig and where they are on the spectrum. And then in the second sentence of the thesis, I talk about my other 2 artifacts. So in this case, I needed a 2-sentence thesis because my artifacts went in so many different directions. So make sure you pause here and take time to carefully read through that thesis and jot down some ideas for yourself about how it might relate to yours. Now let's look at some simpler models. What if, say, I decided that all my artifacts were really on one side of the spectrum? Well, then it's going to be very easy to have a 1-sentence thesis, right? Where I just list the artifacts and say they all emphasize the same thing. But notice how I still use both terms. Even when I see all my artifacts as emphasizing one value over the other, in my thesis, I'm still using both terms because I'm placing them on that spectrum, even if they're all at one end of it. Another example of a simpler kind of thesis would be where you had a mix between your ideas. So let's say Pollock and Haig were on the transcendent side and Smithson and Holt were on the commodified side. You could then have like a while sentence. While these folks are over here, these folks are over here. Or you could say these folks are over here, but these folks are over here. But either way, you end up with a simpler sentence, and it's 1 sentence. So you can see here on the screen now 3 different approaches to a thesis, all of which depend on where your artifacts fall on the spectrum. This is the most complicated thesis when the artifacts, sorry I keep doing that, when the artifacts are all over the place and I need a full range. This is the simplest thesis when my artifacts all are at one end of the spectrum or the other. And then there's kind of a simple but mixed approach that you can take when you've got artifacts on the two extremes that you can easily set up against each other. So those are some ideas for thesis construction. If this web lecture doesn't help you, or you've written a thesis and you think it works, but you don't see it on this page, feel free to email or text me and get some feedback on your specific thesis. Thesis is very important because it is the synthesis of your paper. And if you recall our 3 outcomes for the course, one of them was synthesis. So the thesis in this paper is a really important measure of a course outcome, our ability to pull together different artifacts into one argument. All right, I hope this helps. I look forward to seeing your work.